So when I was growing up, I grew up in, many of you have heard my story before, quite conservative church, where the sermons were actually the same every week. And the central focus, mostly, of them, what was I now know as a vice list. It was the list of people over there, those kinds of people, who did all of those kinds of things. So it was things like adultery, like the scripture says, people who use drugs, people with mental illness, people with addiction, people who were queer. It was just a laundry list of those people over there. Statistically, however, even in that small church that's about the size of ours, there was someone in the pews who had mental illness, someone who was somewhere under the LGBTQ umbrella, someone maybe who was struggling with addiction or was using drugs but not struggling with addiction. All of those people over there who were the bad people were probably us, if the numbers are to be believed. But we had to figure out how to define who we were, and so we described all of the things that we were not, except it wasn't a good description. All it did was create more and more shame. Most people come to church because they are looking for connection to God and connection to a community. But when from the pulpit all you hear is you have to not be any of these things to be one of us, then that creates a reaction in most people. Then I can't tell you then that I have a problem. I can't tell you about this important part of my lived experience, something that maybe even gives me joy. I can't tell you because you're going to judge me. And so people struggle in silence. They suffer in silence. They may even experience their joy in silence or cut off a piece of themselves because it's not appropriate for the church. So that's what's happening in this story. There is what the law is. And there's a lot of people really ready to throw the book at this woman. I do want to point out, though, that it takes two to tango. And where's the guy? Oh, no, it's always the woman's fault, right? And they're using it as this test of Jesus, so that they have a charge to bring against him, because by proxy, if he is kind and gracious to this woman, they will have more rocks to throw. This renegade rabbi who keeps teaching love and acceptance and grace and people's place in community, we got to get him too, and there's a law for that. And there's a mystery in this text. Jesus is writing on the ground in the dust, and everyone speculates about what he might be writing. Perhaps it is a different scripture, one that offers acceptance and grace. There's another take that it is a list of everyone else's sin written right there on the dirt that says, you're not any different than this woman. How dare you claim that you might be? There's a lot of imagination and speculation that can happen in this scripture. But the ending is the same. Jesus explodes this understanding that I am better than this person over here who does something that I deem wrong. That doesn't stand when Jesus is in the mix. He says, no, there is no difference between us and them. You are no different, no better than this woman that you want to throw the book at, literally throw rocks at. And they all maybe a little bit more in touch with their humanity, maybe a little bit ashamed of the actions that they took, go away, leaving her with Jesus. There is no one left to condemn her. No one who can say with honesty and integrity, I am better than you. And so she gets a shot at actual relationship, to be seen for who she is. And maybe there is struggle there. We don't know. There's a lot of unanswered questions in this text. But she knows that her life is worth more than maybe this mistake that she got caught in. So this is UCC Harm Reduction Sunday. When we talk about people who use drugs, at least when I grew up, that was always on that list of those people over there. People maybe who had a different type of relationship with drugs or alcohol, those were those bad people. And yet, again, statistically, they are us, and we are us. And there is nothing in relationship with Jesus that makes one person better or worse than another. And yet we still carry those beliefs sometimes, that those people over there are like that and they can't be of us. Sometimes we want to throw the book at them, say, get sober, get clean. These are the language that we use. But we miss them as people. We miss being in real relationship. We miss the story. We miss being able to be present to them and hear what their goals and their dreams and their pains and their beliefs are. The same grace that we offer one another, or try to, folks who are in a particular category also deserve. But this is a topic that sometimes is difficult for us to engage with. We might literally not know how, or we might carry unconscious bias about people who hold particular identities or who engage in particular actions. And so I want to invite my friend Corey up to give us some brass tacks. Sometimes following in the way of Jesus, we might not know exactly how to do it. And yet there are people who are working for goodness and healing in this world who may use different language than ours, but we recognize the spirit of inclusion and continuity and deep relationship that we believe Jesus was fostering in his community and fosters us, or invites us to foster. We recognize that in people doing work in other sectors. And so the language may not be exactly the same as what we're used to, but I hope you recognize the spirit and in the principles of harm reduction. So I'd love to invite Corey up to teach us about this way of engaging with our neighbors.
Yep, I can stay here.
Okay.
I don't move as much as Mallory does, probably, which is fine. Hi, friends. My name is Corey. I use they, them, and sometimes she pronouns. I work for an organization called NASTAD, which is the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors. It took me the full 2 years that I've worked there to get the acronym down that well. My job on this team is I'm a manager on our drug user health team. So my job is to work with community-based organizations, with health departments, with other types of organizations that maybe just want some support, a lot of underground organizations who are trying to do the work that Mallory is talking about this morning, who are trying to support people who are using drugs, support people who have used drugs in the past, support people who know someone who's using drugs, which is why I'm here today. So, slides? Thank you. So, who's heard of harm reduction before? Is this a familiar concept? Okay, to some of us, and that's okay. I love having a wide variety, honestly. So, harm reduction, at its core, is a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the potentially harmful outcomes associated with drug use. There's a couple other definitions here as well. My favorite one is that it's a social justice and political movement aimed at advocating for the rights and safety of people who are using drugs. So, and the reason that you're hearing me say people who use drugs versus words like addict or junkie or things like that is because those words are frequently very stigmatized, they're very demonized, because when I say the word addict, there's likely an image that pops into your head. There's likely a very specific type of person that you see. And if you looked at me, you wouldn't know that that used to be me, right? And you also wouldn't know that I never fit that image. So I think that it's important for me to share that information with you because I am someone that stands up here and looks quite, I would like to think, very put together and very knowledgeable about things. Mallory even called me an expert, which is very jarring. But when you look at me, you don't think about someone who maybe has used drugs, other than you got my introduction. But you don't think about somebody who, I don't look like someone who you probably thought used a substance, but I did for several years. In fact, I sat in pews and used substances in church as well. So there's a whole bunch of information for you right up front. But that's what harm reduction is. It was started by people who use drugs, aimed at supporting people who use drugs. So if we can have my next slide. So, what is harm reduction in the context of recovery? When we think about recovery and substance use in general, we think about if you're using drugs, that you're not going to use drugs forever. Eventually, you're going to stop using drugs, you're going to go into recovery, and you're going to be completely sober, and your life is going to be completely amazing, and you're going to have everything that you hoped that you would have when you were using drugs that you didn't have because you were using drugs. No, that is completely the opposite of what we like to embody recovery as in the context of harm reduction. Because harm reduction in the context of recovery means any positive change. It means that you could go from drinking a case of beer in a day to 6 beers in a day, and that would be harm reduction. And because that's a positive change for you, because that's making a positive change in your life, that counts as recovery. Recovery can look different for every single person. So there will be people that stop using substances that were really, really harmful for them and still might engage in a margarita on the weekends or a mimosa at brunch. And those people will happily say that they are in recovery, and that's amazing because that's their journey. And there will be people that completely stop using drugs altogether, and that still counts as their version of recovery as well. So there's a couple other kind of definitions as well. A process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness and live a self-directed life, as well as strive to reach their full potential. I want to focus quickly on what it means to live a self-directed life. If I were to walk up to, can I use you as an example? Okay. If I were to walk up to you and tell you that I knew exactly how you should spend the rest of your life because I met you and you complimented my tattoos when I got here, what would you say to me? Yeah, I don't know anything about you. What's your name? Hi, Barbara. It's nice to meet you. And so that seems ridiculous, right? For me to walk up to Barbara and say, I know exactly what you should do for the rest of your life. I know how you're going to be happy, and I know what you need to do in order to be the healthiest version of yourself. And you'd be like, who are you? Now, why do we think it's okay to walk up to someone who's using substances, who's using drugs, who's maybe experiencing homelessness, and say, I know what you need to do in order to live the best, healthiest, most productive version of your life, often without knowing their name. And even if we don't say that to them, there's sometimes that little unconscious bias, that little voice in the back of our head that can really influence the way that we think about people or the way that we talk to and about people. And so I like to use that as an example because it's really uncomfortable, right? It's really uncomfortable for me to tell all of you that you should just exist in a different way without knowing your stories. It's uncomfortable for people who use substances as well. It's uncomfortable for people who use drugs, and it creates a sense of othering, like Mallory talked about. It creates the other people. It creates distance, and therefore we reduce the impact that we have by making that the forefront of our conversations with people. And so I want to quickly acknowledge that we all have unconscious bias. We all have these like thoughts and beliefs that are ingrained in us from a very young age. I have them too, and I've been working in this field since I was for a long time. So so it's important that we walk into this conversation and we walk into Harm Reduction Sunday and we walk into the potential of a changing mindset knowing that we all have those and that it's okay for us to have them as long as we also acknowledge that they're there and that maybe there's room for growth and improvement. So, next slide, please. Thank you so much. Oh, there's so many things to click through on this. I apologize. You can just go through the whole list because I don't know what in order they're in. Okay, so core competencies of harm reduction or of a harm reduction provider. This training has been adapted because I usually give it to like social workers and nurses and people in kind of more direct service positions. So there's some core competencies of a harm reduction provider that I think that can be adopted over into just existing in a community in which there are people who use drugs. Some of those include collaborating with the person who's using substances, who's using drugs, in order to create a plan or to create a, just like an environment where they feel safe and welcome and happy. So that could look like asking, what do you need to feel safe and comfortable and happy? That could look like a lot of things. And I'm not gonna go through every single one of these, so I'm just gonna kind of leave this up for you to read. But one that's also actually all of these are really important, so I say that a lot when I'm doing this training. But radical neutrality is a really important one for us to take a note from as well. What does it mean to be radically neutral? It means to take a non-judgmental, a non-coercive, and a compassionate approach. That is basically saying that while I care for your well-being, Barbara, while I care for your well-being, and I care for everything that you are as a human being, it is not my responsibility to tell you what you should change and what you should keep doing. It's not my responsibility to tell any of you what you should change or what you should keep doing, which is why it's okay if you take grains of salt from this or take nothing from it at all. But it's my job to say to people who are using drugs that while I'm invested in your well-being, while I'm invested in your safety, it is not my job to determine what well-being and safety look like for you, to define that for you. So I like to kind of put that up there. The other thing that feels really important to mention in this situation especially is the practicality and pragmatism, we're going to go with that pronunciation, of what it means to support people. So if I were to tell somebody that they needed to stop using drugs, that sounds really good to me, right? As somebody who only believes in sobriety and abstinence, of course, that sounds really good to me for me to tell someone to stop using drugs. But what I haven't considered is the fact that if you're unhoused and you're using drugs, it might be really difficult to stop using drugs because you don't have a safe place to go home to. Or if you don't have health insurance, it might be really difficult to go to a treatment program or to even get therapy because insurance and treatment are really expensive. The average cost of a 30-day treatment stay in Colorado, by the way, is $32,000 out of pocket. So you should know that up front before you tell somebody that they should just go to treatment. Because also state programs are still expensive and often not effective and also often have month-long waiting lists. So there's a whole other training on that I could just talk about for hours. And then empathy and authenticity. And if you just want to click through the rest of them super fast, I think there's a couple more. Yeah, the ability to relinquish your role as an authority figure, knowing that we don't have authority over people who use drugs just because we think that we might be better than them or might be in a better position than them. And I say that even if that is like an unconscious bias that we have as well. And then consistency, being consistent with the boundaries that we set, because boundaries are a gift that we give to ourselves. Boundaries are a gift that we give to our community. So being very mindful of the way that we set boundaries and the way that we just support people in general, and respect for a client's autonomy or an individual's autonomy, because just because we think somebody should stop using drugs doesn't mean that they always are in a position to be able to do so, and that is their right as someone who has their own autonomy, just like we all do. Okay, this is my favorite slide. I think it's Mallory's favorite slide too. This is the tree of liberation. So to define liberation, liberation is the act of setting someone free from imprisonment, slavery, or oppression. In the context of drug use and sex work, liberation is about freedom from thoughts or behavior, or the idea that we know how it's supposed to be, and how we are conditioned to perpetuate harms to others. So freedom from the idea, the bias that we know what's best, freedom from all of these beliefs that have been so incredibly ingrained within us. And so I want to just kind of go through this really quick. So when we talk about stigma, stigma is something that is also deeply ingrained within all of us. It's something that we are raised with. It's something that's it's ingrained through the media, through all of these really negative biases that we might develop or have through any of the systems that we were raised in. So under stigma, we can kind of look at, I'm going to move forward so I can actually read this. When we're working from a place of stigma, when we're interacting with people from a place of stigma, we are often ignoring the story and projecting our own agenda, which I keep talking about, but I think projecting our own agenda is a really good phrase to keep in mind when we're trying to uncover and kind of work through those biases. We require mandatory things for people because they won't do it otherwise. So that could look like if we are in a space that requires abstinence or requires sobriety, that can be really othering to people, because if we are sitting in, I'm going to use church as an example because we're in church. If we require abstinence and sobriety within a church environment, we are saying that because this other person who is using substances is using drugs, then they are not worthy of being a part of our community because of this one aspect of themselves. If we are going to leave church today and in the next week or two go have a mimosa at brunch or go have a margarita at dinner, do we deserve to be in church next week? Of course we do. Of course we do. And the same thing applies to people who are maybe using different drugs. Because let's be honest, alcohol is a drug in and of itself. So some of us aren't ready for that conversation. Maybe not in this room, but there's a lot of people that aren't ready for that conversation. So, and let's see. Under stigma, we only talk about the disease and not about what people do have control over. So if we're only talking about the disease of addiction, we're not talking about the joys that Mallory was talking about earlier. We're not talking about the wins or the successes of people. We're only focusing on this one part of them, which is that they happen to be someone who uses drugs. And then the trunk beliefs that we see down here, which are our core beliefs, are often that they are not trustworthy, that they are probably lying, that they don't have any willpower, or that they can't help themselves, which is very, again, not respecting people's autonomy. So those are things that I like to think about when we're looking at substances and drug use through a lens of stigma. But if we look at it through a lens of liberation, we talk about core beliefs, trunk beliefs, and root beliefs that really focus on people's strengths and autonomy, which is what we all want people to focus on, right? We don't want somebody to walk in and be like, oh, Corey, you stuttered a little bit in your training. That was not good for you. I don't want that. Nobody wants that. But I would love for someone to tell me that I did a good job, right? That feels amazing. Just like, I don't actually need you to tell me I did a good job, but thank you. But these core beliefs, we focus on their strengths, right? We focus on things about things that they can do. We focus on the fact that people who use drugs can still be, and often are, very capable, very caring, very trustworthy. We talk about the fact that they care about their community, because I have interacted with folks in our community here in Colorado Springs who use drugs, who were some of the most incredibly passionate and wonderfully caring folks, especially for their community, because they truly don't get the support that they need from folks outside of their small, tight-knit community. And when we look at the leaves or the actions from a lens of liberation, We talk about sharing resources and education for their friends because there's not a lot of education and resources about different drugs. And so when you get information about drugs from people who use drugs, you're getting the best information that you could possibly get because they're the ones that are using it and they're the experts of their story. Yeah, and so I really like this graphic. I really like this information, and I hope that that you get something out of that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so how we think. Something that I think is really important to note is that not everyone who uses drugs is someone who experiences addiction. There are recent studies coming out from the CDC. I'm kind of a data nerd also. There are recent studies that are coming out from the CDC that are citing that only around between 10 and 20% of people who actually use drugs that we would consider hard drugs, things like heroin and methamphetamine and other substances that are things other than like alcohol and marijuana, only between 10 and 20% of those individuals actually will develop a physical addiction to those substances. That's really different from what we're taught growing up, a lot of us. We're taught that if you use drugs one time, you're hooked, you're an addict, you're done, your life is ruined. And for most people, that's simply not the case. You can eat a really good piece of food and be like, I could eat that again, and I would like to eat that again, but it's not something that your body starts to crave. It's not something that your body is like, I will cease to exist if I no longer have this. And the same thing applies with drugs. So the first thing that we need to work on is separating the concepts of drug use and addiction. Because just like some of us can go to a bar and have one beer or have one margarita, some of us can't. And so alcohol is actually the most widely utilized or abused substance, and the thing that people become addicted to most frequently. So, and that's one that we have bars all across the city, and no one really says much about that. But as soon as it's a different substance, that's where our stigma really starts to kick in. That's where our bias really starts to kick in. Okay, I think there's 3 points on this slide, so we can go through all of them really quickly. So a couple things to consider is that people may face addiction to one substance but not others. And a good example of that is that it may be safer for a client to smoke marijuana than it is for them to inject methamphetamine. If they don't want to stop using marijuana but express that they no longer want to use methamphetamine, meet them there. Because it can be a lot more physically safe for someone to smoke a substance than to inject a substance. There's a whole host of health reasons for that, but that's a really good example that I like to give. And then remember that not every individual who uses drugs experiences a dependence to those drugs, which we already talked about a little bit. Cool. So, consider how your own biases and misconceptions impact how you show up for individuals. It says clients, we're going to say individuals. Some of the things that we can do in order to really work on that and work on our own biases is to take time to educate yourself, learning the difference between facts and misconceptions when it comes to substance use and harm reduction. By sitting here in this room today, you're educating yourself. You're talking to me. I'm talking to you, actually. But you're listening, and you're taking time to actually start this conversation within yourself about what that actually looks like and means. There's a lot of misconceptions and false information that is kind of spread, especially throughout the media. One thing that is really widely spread among our media is that you can overdose on fentanyl just by touching it. Is that something that we've heard before? Yeah, so that's super not true. You can't overdose on fentanyl just by touching it, but by introducing that false narrative, we've created more fear and more stigma around people who use drugs because they're using this substance that is very scary to us. And you're probably thinking about the police officers all over the country who have said, well, I opened a car door and overdosed because there was fentanyl in that car. And I would like to challenge you to think about why the people that were in that car previously didn't overdose on that fentanyl. So, just a couple of thoughts. Approach things with curiosity, not judgment or assumptions. This is really applicable when we're talking to an individual. How can we have a conversation with an individual without allowing our own bias, our own narrative to be at the forefront of that conversation. How can we start a conversation without allowing our own narrative to become that person's reality in our heads? We can do that by listening to them and trusting what they're saying first and foremost. And then I really challenge you to put yourself under the microscope and really think about what work you still have to do, thinking through what bias is coming up for you the most. The next time you see someone who you think looks a certain way, like they could be using drugs or like they might be unhoused, I invite you to pause and think through what that actually means for you. What does that mean? What does that look like? Why do you have that thought? And then I encourage you to keep thinking through it and unpacking it. The more that you unpack it, the more that you challenge it for yourself, the more that you're able to build compassion and empathy for people who look different than you. And by doing that, you're decreasing the othering. And that is really the goal of Harm Reduction Sunday. Lastly, shifting our own personal view of what recovery can and does look like. We already kind of talked about what it looks like to shift that view, but acknowledging that recovery can be any change that results in positive health outcomes. Considering that abstinence does not have to be and will not be the ultimate goal of recovery for every individual. And allowing individuals to create their own definition of success and their own metric for how they will measure it, walking alongside them and aiding in their discovery process as they define recovery and success for themselves. And to put that in like a lens that may resonate with more people, let's use the gym and like weight loss as an example. There's no one size fits all for losing weight or for every individual that decides that they want to change their body a little bit. So like one person may have the goal of losing 10 pounds and one person may have the goal of losing 50 pounds. And those could both be really reasonable goals for those individuals. And we don't judge those goals because in our heads those people are bettering themselves. And oftentimes they are bettering themselves. But so we allow them to create their own definition of success. And I invite you to start to think about that from a lens of drug use as well. Because how can we define someone else's success when we haven't walked their path? Okay, so this is a fun one because it talks about language. So we can hit it 2 more times, I think. Cool. So our stigmatizing language. You can see that I've kind of replaced words like junkie and addict with words like person who uses drugs or person with substance use disorder. And the reason for that is that we're using person-first language in that kind of when we're talking about somebody. So I haven't used words like addict and junkie, which I said in the beginning, because those are really stigmatizing and because we don't want people who are using drugs to use that as a word to define themselves, because there's so many more things that could be used to define them. They could be artists, they could be creators, they could be like hikers. There's a whole host of things that they could be. And the fact that they use drugs shouldn't be the one determining factor. So there's just a couple of other things on there. We'll read through that really quickly. But yeah, okay, cool. So thinking about language, what person-first language looks like, always amazing. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 more slides. Also, thank you for moving the bubble. That's quite a job. Okay, so incorporating harm reduction strategies into how you communicate and work with clients. We're going to replace clients with community. So we are acknowledging that drug use is a possibility in our world. We are not requiring abstinence, nor do we believe that that will be every client's end goal. Acknowledging that drug use is a possibility is something that I want to kind of bring to the forefront when it comes to community as well, because harm reduction doesn't aim to minimize or erase the fact that drug use can have really harmful negative health outcomes, can have really harmful impacts on communities and people. And a lot of the reason that it can have harmful impacts on communities and people is because we've created these systems that isolate people who use drugs. We've created a lack of community for them, and because of that, it makes it harder for them to stop using substances. It makes it harder for them to find community, a whole host of things. Familiarize yourself with available resources and be ready to share information with individuals about harm reduction tools. There are 2 harm reduction programs here in Colorado Springs. Both of them are completely free and anonymous, and I would love to give Mallory some information to share with y'all, because if I just tell you about it now, we're not going to retain that. But they're both free and anonymous to utilize. They are also both incredible resources that are really positive and have had a really good impact on our community. Build relationships with local harm reduction programs like syringe service programs, Narcan distributors, etc. Providing supplies to your clients when possible. I know that this congregation, do you still have Narcan? Yeah, this congregation has Narcan. I did that training. So it's, it's here within your congregation, within your building, and that's something that is a really good step as well. It's also a great step to have Narcan that you carry on your own. I personally have a purse Narcan, a backpack Narcan, and a car Narcan. And then emphasizing that the individual that is using drugs in your community is in control. Making a change in their life is their choice, not a check mark on your list or agenda. So we are not saying that in order to be a part of this congregation or this community, you have to be sober, you have to be abstinent, because again, that's othering. It's also kind of taking away the control and the autonomy of the individual in your community who's using drugs. Beautiful. Be okay with bite-sized pieces of recovery. I forgot what the last one said. That's on me. But be okay with bite-sized pieces of recovery. Be okay with what change looks like for every individual at their own pace, on their own timeline. Cool. That was all my slides. So I would love to hear if anybody has any questions for me, if there's anything I can answer. This is absolutely a time for you to get information that you need.
We might have questions after.
That's fine. Oh, absolutely. Please do. Cool. Sweet. Well, then I'm done. Thank you for listening.
Corey will be around for a few minutes after the service if you would like to ask them some questions afterward. But thank you. Let's thank Corey for sharing their expertise with us. And this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation. So we did have a Narcan training a couple of years ago, so we sort of familiarized ourselves, but this is an ongoing conversation with folks in our midst, and so we will continue to learn and equip ourselves so that we can companion those folks who we are in relationship with, either as a community or in our personal lives as well, just to equip us to love people better, people who are lonely and have been pushed to the margins by whatever system. So we sing now, called as partners in Christ's service.